They are Mordor.
Hey, how's it going YouTube? This is Devin coming back at you with another video today on Pub Stomp MTG, and it's time to return back to Middle-earth and talk about one of my favorite commanders from the Tales of Middle-earth set, and that of course is Sauron the Dark Lord. This is a commander that I have been brewing constantly, doing new innovations of him. I focused on aristocrats, I focused on a CDH version of him, and I finally landed on a reanimator strategy that I find the most fitting for him. And this is a deck that I'm constantly tuning, by the way. I have it in this very cool case that I found on Etsy. Even though the Eye of Sauron is not necessarily in the books, like for example the Flaming Eye, it's more of a metaphor. I just think it's very cool because I do love the movies too. However, you are probably wondering why I'm making another video on Sauron the Dark Lord. I've already made two previously, and the simple answer is pretty much I have a lot of experience with Sauron the Dark Lord. There's a lot of pitfalls that I've overcome that I didn't have experience with in the previous videos that I do want to share now. Another big reason why I wanted to bring this video forth is simply I'm a super fan when it comes to Lord of the Rings. I love reading the books. Every single year I at least read one of them. For example, this year I did read The Hobbit, which honestly I love rereading over and over again. I've been reading it since middle school. It's definitely one that I love going back to, simply because it's just a fun adventure if anything else. Last year I did read The Silmarillion, which is a pretty tough read, but I absolutely find it fascinating, especially with Sauron's history, and that's why I wanted to focus on Sauron today. Not only is it one of my favorite commanders to play, and one commander that'll definitely make you enemy number one at the table, which is kind of fitting because of course Sauron is the true enemy of Middle-earth besides Melkor, or should I say Morgoth. However, many of you are probably familiar with this commander, but if you aren't, let's read what it does first before diving any further. His casting cost is 3 blue, black, and a red, so in total 6 mana to cast this commander. He's a legendary creature, Avatar Horror. He has the ability of Ward, sacrifice a legendary artifact or legendary creature, which is pretty fitting because in the books Gil-galad and Elendil both defeat Sauron at the cost of their lives. So in order to defeat Sauron, you need to sacrifice that legendary creature, and everybody knows with the One Ring, you need to sacrifice it in order to kill him permanently. But going back to the card, whenever an opponent casts a spell, amass orcs 1, because every time you reveal yourself to Sauron, the more he's going to be spreading his orcs around to defeat you. Whenever an army you control deals combat damage to a player, the ring tempts you, and whenever the ring tempts you, you may discard your hand. If you do, you draw 4 cards. And at the end of the day, he does have a 7/6 body. And if you are not familiar with the ring tempting you mechanic, it is a little complex. I put the rules up on the video so that you could see it for yourself. So if you want to pause it really quick, here's your chance. But now going back to Sauron, there is a lot to do with this commander. This commander is basically just a big giant toolbox. It protects itself and basically just has hexproof. It makes a bigger and bigger orc army where you could swing in for some serious combat damage, or you could use it for aristocrats and some strategies I'll talk about later. And of course, when you deal combat damage, the ring will tempt you, and there's a lot of other options in the deck that the ring will tempt you with. So that way you can get that value of discarding your hand and drawing 4 cards. That last ability is what I'm going to be using most in this deck, so that way we could discard our hand, draw 4 new cards, reanimate some big giant creatures later on. I will say that's what I find very enjoyable about this deck, is the fact that Sauron is essentially just leading his army to victory. He's very sticky on the board, and he's essentially just an outlet just to discard a bunch of cards like big giant beefy creatures so that we can reanimate them later. But before I do dive any further into this deck list, make sure to use my TCG player affiliate down below in the description to support the channel if you are looking for any of these cards. It really does go a long way in supporting what I do on this channel. And if you want to take it a little bit further, consider joining my Patreon. There's a lot of great benefits if you want to look down below in the description, see which one's right for you. Now that I've mentioned those things, let's get right into the deck list. So when I organized this deck, I had one major philosophy. I wanted to make this deck flavorful, but also quite powerful. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This was a pretty hard balancing act. I wanted to make sure that I could have fun with this deck with the Reanimator strategy, all the while staying in the game, because you can make it pretty flavorful, but if you don't have some powerful cards, you could definitely fall back. But I didn't want to make it all too powerful, adding in a lot of free counter spells or a lot of free mana rocks, where it just becomes uber powerful, destroying the game. So again, it was a pretty hard balancing act, figuring figuring out which pieces to include and not to include. And so one priority I absolutely had to make was focusing on Lord of the Rings art. There's a lot of cards that are super powerful in the format. One example of that is of course the One Ring that Sauron crafted himself. This one's not only super powerful in the Lord of the Rings universe, but of course it's very powerful in Magic the Gathering in a general sense. And just to kind of put it simply, this is just a great card draw engine. Just the fact you keep putting burn encounters on this, you're drawing more cards. And not to even mention the fact that when you cast this, you gain protection from everything until your next turn, which is honestly more useful than not. This is just one card I feel like is a little too pushed, but of course in this deck it's very flavorful, even though Sauron technically never gets the One Ring after he loses it. But besides that point, this is one example of a card that is way too pushed that I decided to throw it in for flavor reasons. The same can be said for Orcish Bowmasters. This is another excellent choice, even though it is more CDH worthy, but it really punishes that card draw effects that a lot of people have with Heuristic Studies and Mystic Remoras. This just pings down a lot of different creatures on the battlefield the more people draw cards. This essentially just pings down a lot of different creatures on the battlefield, all the while just putting a big giant orc army on your side of the battlefield too. So this is just another great effect that's very powerful, but also very flavorful with Sauron. There are some other cards that are in here mainly for flavor reasons because they have Lord of the Rings art on them. For example, Diabolic Intent, you sacrifice a creature to tutor for a card, and luckily with Sauron we're making creatures all the time with that orc army. The same can be applied for Pact of the Negation with that beautiful art on there. Another reason why I wanted to include in the list is it's a free interaction all the while having that flavor. Toxic Deluge was in the precon, the same can be said for Reanimate, which of course Reanimate has the art with the Nazgul, which is perfect because that's what this deck is all about. Another flavor win would be Palantir of Orthanc, mainly because at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on the Palantir of Orthanc and scry 2. Target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on the Palantir of Orthanc, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. And if you notice in the deck list, there's a lot of big beefy creatures. They may lose a lot of life in the process, so they may just give you the card draw. Either way, it's going to be a win-win for us, putting creatures in the graveyard so that we can reanimate them later, or get some extra card advantage. I also find Morgul Knife or Shadow Spear amazing in this deck because we are making a huge giant orc army. It might essentially just become chump blocked. This is a way we could give our orc army trample and lifelink. Lifelink is actually very good in this deck because we may lose a lot of life in the process. And so this is just a quick, easy, efficient way of giving our creatures trample and lifelink. And not to mention it's the Morgul Knife. And so of course in this deck I threw in all 9 Nazgul. They were pretty hard to find as I wanted the foil showcase, and luckily I got them before they went too expensive. But these essentially go hand in hand with Sauron because when it enters the battlefield, the ring tempts you. We want temptation triggers for Sauron to draw cards and discard our hands so that we can reanimate creatures later. But if anything else, they become threats on the battlefield. The more Nazgul appear, the bigger they each will become when the ring tempts you. You put a 1/1 counter on each Wraith you control, and because you could have 9 in your deck, these could get absolutely huge. I remember one game in particular where I had all Nazgul in my graveyard and I casted a Living Death. Of course my opponents got some creatures on the battlefield, but I got all 9 Nazgul on the battlefield and they all triggered simultaneously. And one thing to note about the Nazgul is the fact whenever the ring tempts you, you put a +1/+1 counter on each Wraith you control. So essentially in that game they all got pretty much 81 +1/+1 counters, and because I had 9 of them, they were pretty hard to deal with in a general nutshell. Besides that point, the Nazgul are pretty good in this deck. They provide great utility with our commander, but also can be great finishers if you get enough of them on the battlefield too. Which does bring me to the next one. Of course, the most faithful servant of Sauron is the Witch King of Angmar. And for flavor reasons, I was very close to taking this one out because of course there are 9 Nazgul, and the Witch King of Angmar is part of them. So either I thought, okay, maybe I'll have 8 Nazgul cards in the deck and Witch King of Angmar, or just have 9 Nazgul completely, but I decided, I didn't want to worry about that too much. The Witch King of Angmar and the 9 Nazgul are both very great and very fitting with Sauron. So I just decided to leave it alone because the Witch King is a very good card in the deck. With his ability is essentially just a deterrent for our opponents to attack us, because not only can the ring tempt us, they will have to sacrifice a creature that dealt combat damage to us. Not only that, he is a pretty good blocker himself, because if you discard a card, it will gain indestructible until end of turn and you tap it. So when you block with the Witch King, you tap it in response and discard a card to give it indestructible. And if you go into that situation where you're playing a Living Death, you could just discard the creatures you want to put them into the graveyard and then cast that Living Death to have them all enter the battlefield. There are some other cards that focus on the ring tempt you mechanic that I did want to focus on. Bilbo Retired Burglar is an excellent choice, even though it's kind of ironic that Bilbo's joining Sauron in this instance. When he enters or leaves the battlefield, the ring tempts you, and of course if you make him a ring bearer, he's very hard to block because he only has 1 power. And when he deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token so it can ramp us a little further to cast Sauron. I also love Call of the Ring. This is going to be an instant include at the beginning of your upkeep. The ring tempts you, just a constant way where we could just draw a new set of cards every single time we go to our upkeep. It also does have that added ability whenever you choose a creature as your ring bearer, you may pay 2 life. If you do, you draw a card. That's excellent. More card draw, more options for us. So again, there are a lot of options that have the ring tempt us, and there are a lot of other options that are basically flavor wins for the deck. You can check out the deck list down below in the description again if you wanted to check it out. But of course, the main focus of the deck is Reanimator. We want to discard cards with Sauron to put big beefy creatures in the graveyard and draw into our reanimation pieces. So the beauty of this deck is there's a lot of options to reanimate creatures. There's a one-time effects like Reanimate, of course. I mentioned this one previously. All for 1 mana, you return a target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You lose life in the process, but that's not a big downside, especially if it's a big scary creature that could basically take over the game. I also like Persist in the deck. This is a great option because for 2 mana, you return a non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. That's not a big downside, knowing that a lot of our creatures are going to be huge. Too greedily, too deep can reanimate a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield and act as a board wipe because that creature will deal damage equal to its power to each other creature. Victimize is another great option. You sacrifice a creature and then return 2 target creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield. They do enter tapped, but again, you're returning 2 creatures. That is an excellent rate. I also wanted to include Animate Dead because it does have Spinosaurus art on it. If we're talking about the Judge promo, and you know me with dinosaurs, I had to throw it in there. Even though dinosaurs and Middle-earth don't necessarily mix in with each other. But I would say the best way to reanimate creatures is reanimating them en masse. I already mentioned previously Living Death. This is a great option for 5 mana. The same can be applied for Funeral Room and Awakening Hall. This is a great Aristocrats piece on one side. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. But if we use the other side, Awakening Hall for 8 mana, if you unlock the door, return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. That is going to help close out games, especially if we have a big beefy graveyard. But I would say the best option would be Rise of the Dark Realms. This is easily one of the best reanimation spells that you can use that will basically close out the game for sure. You just put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control. That does include your opponents. So of course, if you have some haste outlets and you cast this before combat, most likely it's going to be spelling good game for your opponents. So those are some of the reanimation spells, but now let's talk about some cards to reanimate. And there are a ton of options, and I mean an absolute ton of options of cards that you could reanimate. I added, of course, some Middle-earth cards like the Balrog of Moria. This is an excellent choice because you can essentially cycle it and then create 2 treasure tokens, put it into the graveyard, then reanimate it later. It's a trample hasty boy with an 8 power and 8 toughness body. But not only that, if somebody tries to remove the Balrog of Moria, you may exile it. When you do, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target creature card that player controls, so it's great removal when it does get removed. Another great option that's very familiar to Smaug is Cavern Horde Dragon. So it costs 9 mana, but it can be reduced based off of the number of artifacts an opponent controls. It does have Flying, Trample, and Haste, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you create a treasure token for each artifact that player controls. So of course, if somebody's playing a big artifact deck, you're obviously going to be targeting them. Another great card is Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. Even though this is 2 mana when it does enter the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless it escapes, but it does have a very powerful Titan-like effect. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then for each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life, and it does have an escape cost of 2 black and 2 red. Exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So I like this because if we discard Kroxa, at least if we have 5 other cards in our graveyard, we can just pay its escape cost and put it back onto the battlefield. I did throw in some other dragons in the deck like Dragon Lord Kolaghan. Of course, it does have flying and haste itself with a 6/5 body, so not too shabby for 6 mana. Of course, if we reanimate it, all our other creatures will gain haste in the process, and we seriously want to give haste to some of our creatures like the Ancient Brass Dragon, Ancient Copper Dragon, and Ancient Silver Dragon. These all have great combat triggers. He either draws cards, gain treasure, or reanimate creatures. So that's why I did want to throw them in the deck, because they provide such great utility, either giving us card draw, mana, or reanimation. That's all we want to do in this deck. But now I want to talk about cards that are basically the best of the best that'll help you end the game. So let's start off small and talk about Warren Soul Trader. This has an incredible effect. I used to have Phyrexian Altar in this deck, but replaced it with Warren Soul Trader because of one simple ability, and that's the fact that you could sacrifice a creature and create a treasure token. With Phyrexian Altar, you just add a mana, but you lose that mana. With Treasure, it just stays there on the battlefield. And so every time someone casts a spell with Sauron, we make an Orc army, and we can sacrifice that Orc army for 1 life and create a treasure token. So essentially, whenever somebody casts a spell, we make a treasure token. The same can be applied for Razaketh. If somebody casts a spell with Sauron and Razaketh on the battlefield, that just means we're tutoring every time somebody casts a spell too. And I wanted to note with Sauron's ability, when you amass Orcs 1, you'll have to sacrifice that Orc before the trigger resolves. So instead of putting a 1/1 counter on it, you sacrifice that Orc in response and make a new Orc. Another card that synergizes with Sauron is Shieldred the Apocalypse. This is a little bit of a wheel strategy. I have about 3 wheels in this deck, and so there are a lot of reasons why I wanted Shieldred in the deck. It punishes people for card draw. A lot of people are way too greedy in Commander with their card draw. This makes them lose 2 life in the process for each card draw. All the while, when we draw cards, especially with Sauron, if we discard our hand and draw 4 cards, we are going to be gaining 8 life, and there's a lot of ways we lose life in this deck. We want to gain that life back, and Shieldred's one way to do that. And so I thought to myself, I think Shieldred is a great utility piece, synergizes with our commander, and of course with wheels. If we do wheel the table with like a Wheel of Fortune, each opponent will lose 14 life while we gain 14 life. And the last card that's won me so many games because of Rise of the Dark Realms is Terror of the Peaks. Everybody knows this one, everybody loves this one. One of my favorite cards of all time, without a doubt, because whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of the Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So this is one way to close out the game if you have one of those effects like Rise of the Dark Realms, or even Awakening Hall, where you just return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Terror of the Peaks will essentially blast the table down, especially if you put all Nazgul on the battlefield and they all trigger simultaneously before you do the Terror of the Peaks triggers. You will deal 82 damage to each opponent or each creature they control, but most likely you want to deal damage to an opponent, and you can close out the game that way. So obviously I had to mention Terror of the Peaks because it's won me so many games. So that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this special episode on Sauron the Dark Lord. This is one of my favorite decks of all time. This is probably a deck I'm never going to take apart because of how fun it is. This is a deck I completely own on paper, so all the card treatment you see is what I essentially have. And this is a deck, whenever I pull it out, I get very excited because I never really know what kind of game I'm going to get with Sauron because there's so many different things that happen within the games. But I would love to hear your thoughts down below. How has Sauron done for you? Are there any other tips and secrets that you found with Sauron to be enjoyable? I would love to hear your thoughts. Even though it's been a year and a half, this is easily one of my favorite commanders of all time. I just love the versatility of this commander, and I love Lord of the Rings, of course. So on your way out, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. That's definitely one of the best ways to support the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.